Today we have with us an author, Neslihan Cevik, who wrote the book Muslimism in Turkey and Beyond. Thank you so much for giving us time today.
Thank you.
Okay, Islam is a religion that is still interpreted in its old traditional ways when it comes to application to women and their rights. Do you think the challenges of the 21st century will change the traditional concept that are framed by mullahs for women?
That's actually a really good question because it allows us to kind of like directly go into the core of the issue. There is some sort of irony here. I mean, you look at the radical Islamists and then they accuse modernity for degenerating Islam, but in fact tradition has been playing that role for many, many centuries. Unfortunately, throughout centuries, traditional values and concepts have acquired power as supposed forms of piety, and those concepts have been defined along patriarchal codes and gender relations. And when we look at 21st century, of course, this is a very particular context where concepts like globalization, modernity, human rights, women's rights, individual rights, civil rights, all of those concepts allow us, in fact, to look back at tradition, to criticize tradition, and for the part of Islam, it allows us to kind of dig into theology itself and then kind of like select out the traditional practices that have acquired power as supposed forms of piety. So rather than modernity causing and identity degeneration, I think it allows us to find the identity by selecting out the traditional practices and looking at the theology again and reading it again.
Okay, you must have studied different Muslim societies. Based on your observation and studies, how do you define the major differences that you have noted in the Arab world, a modern country like Turkey, and then South Asian countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, where women lack basic human rights?
Right. So, I mean, this, first of all, tells us something about religion. Of course, religion has an objective essence. It provides the believers with an objective essence. But then in every institutional cultural context, what people do with this essence differ from each other. And this is very important to understand because there is no, so it kind of like helps us with debating against this argument that Islam has to produce, patriarchal, misogynist, authoritarian codes. For example, when you look at Turkey, especially after the 1980s, you see that Muslim women have been increasingly participating in the public sphere and taking up on new public roles, whether this is in education, human rights, civil associations, politics, theology. There are now a lot of women with PhDs in theology, and these women are articulating, they push for a new Islamic gender politics and discourse, one that criticizes that tradition, and also patriarchal codes that come from modernity itself. Now, of course, for this happen in Turkey, there were certain conditions that enabled it. Back in the 1980s, we see the state retreating from the economic area as well as the political area and cultural reproduction. And that created new opportunity spaces for Muslim groups hitherto marginalized to move into the economic center, to move into the political center, and to move into educational institutions. And that, very importantly, until the 1980s, modernity in Turkey has been defined mostly through the secularist ideas, and it excluded religion. But after the 1980s, new conceptions that came with the liberal order started to define modernity, such as individual rights, entrepreneurship, equality, and so forth. And I think that really helped Muslims in Turkey to reconsider what modernity meant. I mean, it was no longer the forbidden modern that was promoted so by the Islamists, but it was a modernity that we could, in fact, engage and take advantage of and participate in. And so the historical conditions in Turkey allowed for, new forms or alternative religious expressions to emerge that didn't see modernity as a sum of evil that destroyed, Muslim sensibilities. Now, when we look at other parts of the Muslim world, maybe we should, examine those historical conditions, because when we look at Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia, and more broadly to the Arab region, we see that the situation is very concerning. Instead of Islam's own theological progressive sources, the institutions and the discourse they rely on these traditional concepts that oppress women. I mean, we have to even fight to drive, or to choose career over marriage, or even simply in choosing a spouse. But so the conditions there have been, in other countries have been such that it couldn't create this, opportunity space for alternative religious expressions to emerge. And I think, although, on a more positive note, the Arab Spring has shown that such cultural sentiments indeed exist in the region. It was interesting throughout the Tahrir Square, risings. Of course, there were a lot of documents that were signed, about democracy, about the state model, but there was one thing that was signed and barely anyone talked about it, and the document was called Starting by Myself. And in this document, the Egyptians would sign stuff like, I'm not going to litter streets, I'm not going to bribe officers, and I'm not going to harass women. Mm-hmm. So new gender codes are emerging in the region. However, they failed into translating to political change, and that's what Turkey managed, basically. So those cultural sentiments were able to translate into new institutions, everyday life institutions, and political institutions, but the region right now is lacking that. But that doesn't mean that the awakening and the sentiments that's going to lead in the future, hopefully, towards a more egalitarian gender relationship. Those cultural sentiments exist. And I think more globally also maybe we should think about the broader context. It's not just Muslim women, it's women in general. When you look at the European Union, when you look at the USA, you have gender disparity everywhere. It's more so for the Muslim women. But I think, again, on a more positive note, as a world, we are going towards this discourse where we question this gender disparity. We question the idea that, womanhood is always defined around motherhood and wifehood. And in Turkey, what we see is actually women are willing to discover themselves, understand who they are, develop life strategies, and then get into marriage. And so that's one kind of like strategy they use in order to combat against patriarchal codes. So again, in the long term, I'm positive that such cultural sentiments in the region will, further emerge. But for now, the situation is quite concerning.
Okay, talking about religion used as a tool to oppress women, how can that be prevented? And then what do you think can be done for emancipation of women that are faced with the threats from IS, Al-Qaeda, and then Taliban?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I should say that the current context we live in, that's marked by the rise of third wave jihadism, which is, extremely violent, it's theatrical, it puts, these killings on YouTube, and then there's this constant, feeling of murder. So this is a very, concerning situation, but I think that it provides us with an opportunity that we never had. So instead of maybe being pessimistic or optimistic, we need to be opportunistic. This is the time for us Muslims to really dig into our tradition, to really dig into our theology, and then produce a counter narrative from within, not through the discourse of the West, not through the discourse of any alien concept, but using our own tradition, our own progressive concepts, and to produce a counter narrative. And we need to do that. This is our duty. And part of that, so the gender aspect of it will determine whether that counter narrative will be successful or not, because in order for Muslim societies to have a really, a democratically defined societies, you can't ignore the aspect of women. And also from a practical point of view, it makes a lot of sense because, even if you look at the rentier states that has a lot of oil, they have to now, start creating a national bourgeoisie, and you have all these women who are not working. You have to involve them in the workforce because it's good for the nation state. But beyond that, as a discourse, as a more normative position, there's equality, and that equality is accepted by Islam. Hopefully this is not going to sound too detailed, but I would like to bring into attention the concept of belief in Islamic theology. Now, in Islam, we define true piety as iman. And iman is, in the Quranic usage, it means basically this unshakable conviction to God. And for someone to have this conviction, they have to bind their heart to God. Now, this is very important. It has serious implications because the heart cannot be controlled. A state can emerge and say, look, from today on, everybody has to wear the hijab, or from today on, alcohol is banned. But a state can enact a law saying, all citizens, you love, from today on, you have to love God, because the heart cannot be controlled. Now, what does that mean? That means freedom of choice is indeed intrinsic and constitutive to the concept of belief in Islamic theology. Now, a step further, sociologically and politically, what does that mean? That means that an external authority, from a theological standpoint of view, have no right to impose religion on you, because you have to choose religion through voluntary submission. Now, this idea protects individuals vis-a-vis authoritarian states or authoritarian communities, both men and women. And in parentheses, Iman is a gender-neutral concept. It applies to man and woman equally. So it also protects women vis-a-vis men who claim a moral superiority. One example is that, let's talk about hijab. In Turkey, back in the 80s, so throughout my interviews for the book work, I was talking to a lot of women, and then they defined the 1980s Turkey as the uniform era. It was the uniform era because the hijab, its color, its style, how you wear it, was defined by the Jama'ah and the Tariqa. And those prescriptions were determined mainly by men. So basically, men was policing how women were to dress, even for hijab. It wasn't only just you must wear hijab, it was also how you're going to wear it. But by the 1990s, this started to change, and now women have their own self-autonomy and moral agency in wearing the hijab, in styling it. So self-styles started to replace prescriptions, and so the idea of I can self-style my hijab speaks back into this concept of iman, where the individual has moral autonomy and agency, and indeed, all of us, according to this theology, will be judged by God based on those individual decisions we make. And there's something even more interesting. I think a husband forcing her wife to veil, to put the hijab on, a state forcing their citizens to put the hijab on, falls prey to the biggest sin that was defined in the Quran, shirk, which is polytheism. Why? Because simply by doing that, they bestow the moral authority that's only due to God to a mortal entity. And that's the biggest sin that's defined in Quran. So it's not only against individual rights, but it's also against the Quranic terminology and the theology of Islam.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.